In this video, we're going to go over compensation scenarios. We're going to look first at buyer agent and buyer brokerage commission or compensation scenarios because they're the most complex. And then we'll conclude with listing agent and listing brokerage compensation because it is the more direct of all of the possible of the different types of compensation scenarios that we'll be looking at. As we go through this, any information you see in red, that is taken from an article that was published by Curtis Bullock, the attorney who was also the head of the Salt Lake Board of Realtors and the Wasatch Front MLS, as he's worked through a number of scenarios that are commonly occurring and are most common occurrences with compensation, particularly with buyer brokerage and buyer agent commission. So let's get started. First of all, I need to understand that as we look at this, we're going to be looking at options. Option one, which is where a listing agent is paying the buyer agent and the compensation amount is negotiated through the use of the real estate purchase contract. Or excuse me, real estate brokerage compensation agreement. Now, that form is created specifically to work between brokerages and brokerages, and we'll look at that one in depth. Option two is where the seller and buyer agent, through the buyer, are negotiating in the REPC in paragraph 4.3 the amount that the seller will be paying to the buyer agent brokerage for buyer brokerage compensation. But that negotiation itself actually takes place between buyer and seller in the real estate purchase contract. The third option we'll look at is in the event that there is no third-party compensation, either brokerage to brokerage or seller to brokerage, but in the event the buyer themselves will be paying that compensation under the exclusive buyer broker agency agreement. And then we'll go back and at the end, and we're going to look at the exclusive right to sell, which is how the listing agents and listing brokerage is compensated. So let's take a look at option number one. Option number one involves the use of the real estate brokerage compensation agreement. This is an agreement between brokerages. So seller's brokerage, buyer's brokerage, buyer name, seller name, or property name. This, because it is a contractual agreement, it does have an expiration date. If you contact a seller agent, the listing agent, and say, we saw the home, the buyer saw the home, they are interested in putting in an offer, is the seller offering any kind of compensation? If the agent indicates that they are, then you need to follow up and find out, do they want that handled through the REPC or through the real estate brokerage compensation agreement? If they've already agreed to allow the real estate brokerage compensation agreement, that means that the sellers have already agreed to allow the listing brokerage to enter into a direct compensation agreement with the buyer brokerage. This is completed at the same time as the offer, but as we'll see in a moment, it does not actually. It's between the brokerages, so we have to have there's a date on there that becomes then the term that this would be valid for. Please note that it's mutually agreed upon that if the buyer's offer is accepted by the seller, we're working through the process and we have to extend. So you put the deadline here to coincide with the settlement deadline or a couple days after settlement deadline, so everything can go through with the offer. And now we have to extend the offer. As long as the offer is active and valid, this compensation agreement goes in place. This is allowable under the buyer broker agency agreement section 2.2 that states that satisfaction of the brokerage fee by a third party. The third party in this case being the listing brokerage. So here's where we get to the meat of it, what you're all interested in: compensation for sellage brokerage. This can be done either as a dollar amount or a percentage of, and find out if it's gross or net acquisition price. What the MLS is being updated to allow indication of net acquisition price again. But just as a quick reminder, gross means whatever the agreed upon purchase price is, that's what the compensation percentage is based on. Net acquisition price is if there are any kind of seller concessions, anywhere from paying for a home warranty all the way up to tens of thousands of dollars toward the buyer closing costs or loan points or all of those combined. Any type of agreement that takes away from the actual total gross acquisition price. You can put a dollar amount or that percentage. Please note that it's or. So find out from the listing brokerage. Listing brokerage may have entered into an agreement that it's a flat fee. This is how much. Or they may have entered into an agreement that says it's a specific percentage. Now, keep in mind that the buyer, you're only allowed to receive what you're agreed to under the buyer broker agency agreement, and the listing brokerage is only allowed to compensate up to what they've agreed to with the seller in their exclusive right to sell listing agreement. So if the seller has agreed to offer 2% of gross acquisition price there, and you're under a buyer broker agency agreement for 3% or anything more than that percentage that's available, then you're going to have to look at either accepting the 2%, or we'll look at some additional scenarios through the use of the REPC to try to negotiate from buyer to seller to make up that difference. Or you'll just have to go have your buyer pay it. Please note that this then has all the standard clauses we see in our contracts. Provision of the seller's agreement authorizes the seller's brokerage to offer and enter the compensation agreement. Payment of compensation is conditioned upon successful closing of the real estate transaction. In other words, if this deal doesn't go through, the listing brokerage is not obligated to pay. Now, you can put additional terms in here if you choose, but that may be something that's negotiated with the other side. If the purchase price is between this percentage and this price and this price, they may be willing to pay a higher percentage. Now, please note who has to sign this: seller brokerage, buyer brokerage. This is an agreement between the brokerages. Once the brokerages have entered into the agreement, then they are responsible for providing copies to the seller and the buyer, for the seller and the buyer to acknowledge that this agreement has been entered into between the brokerages that represent each of those parties. That's why this is an acknowledgement of receipt. Seller and buyer are not signatories on this as one of the executors. They simply are receiving it and acknowledging that they had given prior permission, the seller given prior permission for their brokerage to enter into the agreement. Buyer's brokerage through the buyer broker agency agreement entered into it, and now it's been authorized by the agents or brokers from both sides. Now, it may happen that this amount does not totally cover the amount that your buyer is under a compensation agreement for. In that case, then they'll need to look at either negotiating additional amounts of the REPC or pay the balance. So speaking of the REPC, we're going to look at option 2 now. This is where the buyer, through the use of the purchase contract, requests that the seller pay the buyer agent or buyer brokerage a compensation that's negotiated in the purchase contract. So let's take a look at how that could play out. First of all, we're going to look at some very specific aspects of this. Seller paid commission. Section 4.3 allows the seller, not the listing brokerage, to pay the buyer agent commission. In other words, this is commission that will be taken from the seller proceeds at settlement and then to the buyer's brokerage as satisfaction of Section 2.2 of the buyer broker agency agreement, satisfaction of brokerage fee by a third party. You'll note that the amount that can be entered, seller and buyer agree that the seller shall contribute a percentage of the purchase price or dollar amount to the buyer's brokerage if applicable. Now, a word of caution with this. Always keep in mind that you cannot receive, as the buyer's agent, any more compensation than was agreed to in the buyer broker agency commission agreement. So if you sign for 2% on that, seller says they're willing to pay 3%, you can only receive 2%. Or specified dollar amount. Now, this has come up recently in litigation where the seller put a percentage amount here, or the buyer put a percentage amount here, and buyer agent didn't feel comfortable leaving this blank because we've been taught over and over and over, don't leave boxes blank, and put or $0 to the buyer brokerage. Seller took the contract to their attorney. Attorney argued on their behalf that because this is a either or, the seller could choose which of the two they were going to exercise, and they were going to exercise that they were paying $0, not the percentage. They had agreed to a percentage or dollar amount. Consequently, we are anticipating at some point that this or will be removed, or you'll expect to see an and. So if you are looking at a percentage amount of purchase price, put that here and put an NA on the dollar amount. Don't put a 0 in there because attorneys are successfully arguing that means you're asking for one or the other. Seller's going to say, great, I'm going to take the 0%, the $0. Okay. Now, there are some additional language in here to verify. This payment shall be made in addition to any other compensation agreed to by the seller's brokerage to buyer's brokerage, if applicable. We just talked about that real estate brokerage compensation agreement. If the real estate brokerage compensation agreement is already in place between the brokerages, and the buyer then puts a percentage in here of the purchase price, that is in addition to what was already agreed upon. So if they've already got a real estate brokerage compensation agreement for a specific percentage, and then put another percentage here, you're adding those two together. As a buyer agent, I need to be aware that, again, I can't have those two numbers add up to more than my brokerage can receive through the buyer broker agency agreement. As a listing agent, I need to watch that number as well. And if I've already entered into that separate brokerage to brokerage agreement and then present this to my seller and say, yeah, okay, whatever, and sign it, I've now obligated them to pay an additional amount. So keep that in mind, that these are those two tied together. This is one way that this can be used if the amount agreed to in the real estate brokerage compensation agreement doesn't cover the full amount under the buyer broker agency agreement. Again, this amount can be as a percentage or as a dollar amount, but that's where the in addition to comes in. It's a total sum. Now, Curtis Bullock, in his opinion, noted that in most transactions, this is very uncommon. It's less common. You're either going to have that brokerage to brokerage compensation, or you're going to use this to negotiate it, but not the two of them combined, although it can be done. Now, when the real estate brokerage compensation agreement is not used, if the seller agrees to cover the full buyer's agent commission in the REFC, then you need to put that percentage in there. Then the real estate brokerage compensation agreement is also unnecessary because it's now been integrated into the purchase contract. When the real estate brokerage compensation agreement is used, and if the listing brokerage covering the full brokerage commission amount here, then this is marked NA and NA. There's nothing else to add to it. So keep that in mind. If you have that real estate brokerage compensation agreement, don't leave this blank. Simply mark that it doesn't apply because that other agreement already is in place, and it is a legal binding contract. And then obviously the final one is if there is, in the event where neither the seller nor the listing broker pays any type of compensation to the buyer agents, we put in an offer, have an amount there, and seller rejects the offer or counters without anything there, then the buyer is going to be responsible under the exclusive buyer broker agency agreement. And we'll look at that in a moment. Now, keep in mind that this has always been negotiable. This is now negotiable directly in the contract. This has all parties will now see directly in the contract what the amount is and how, in this case, how it's going to be compensated. One way of negotiating this has been then If you contact the seller agent says, seller said they'll entertain all offers. You don't know what you do when you feel like you're a little bit shooting in the dark. Put the percentage in there and recognize that you may need to negotiate. You may come back to the seller says, okay, fine, we'll do that, but we're going to bump up purchase price in order to cover it. Or you may choose to put in the offer. We're going to bump up the purchase price a bit to cover that, as long as it seems reasonable that the property will, of course, appraise for that value and that your buyer qualifies for that higher purchase price on what they're qualified for lending. But that's a tool to use in negotiating this. That's the most commonly used tool used in negotiating this. Okay, we're going to take a look at now option 3, the use of the exclusive buyer broker agency agreement. In the event that the buyer is unable to negotiate in any way a third party, either the listing brokerage or the seller, to compensate their buyer agent. So let's take a quick look at paragraph 2, the brokerage fee and the buyer broker agency agreement again. Keep in mind that the brokerage fee and amount of dollar amount and percentage of gross acquisition price. This is whatever you've already previously negotiated with the buyer. The and allows for many brokerages charge a brokerage fee that an agent may want to pass that cost along to their buyer. Or if you're using a transaction coordinator here, and depending on what your individual compensation plan is, if you're having to pay the transaction coordination fee and you don't want that to come out of your commission amount, then you could put that amount in there and the percentage. But whatever that amount is, percentage of the gross acquisition price of the property, that's the maximum amount you could receive. Now, if you can't, if for some reason that amount isn't offered as compensation by a third party, or your client isn't able to cover it, you can always receive less than that. And typically you want to do that in writing as well as an addendum to the exclusive right to sell, that in the event of the purchase of X property, buyer agent compensation, brokerage fee under 2.1 shall be this amount, so that it's documented. Because then if that one doesn't work out, but they go somewhere else and they are going to get it, you get 3% to do it. Okay, satisfaction by third party. Those first 2 options we looked at and their combinations, either brokerage to brokerage or buyer to seller, or brokerage to brokerage with additional amount from buyer to seller, those combinations will qualify under this satisfaction by a third party. Buyer may have to be reminded that the brokerage fees are due and payable upon settlement on purchase or lease or option, depending what they're under contract to provide. If the transaction is prevented by default to the buyer, the brokerage fee shall be immediately payable. If the buyer continues to default and not follow through, technically we could pursue that. Very infrequently does the brokerage do that, just because of the amount of time and expense involved, but they need to understand that. Now, you need to understand that this section can weigh heavily on a buyer. They need to understand that if the seller isn't compensating, then they're going to have to pay it. And that could affect their decision on whether or not they're going to purchase a property. They may really like the property, but if the seller isn't compensating and they're going to have to come up with the compensation for the brokerage and can't afford to do that, plus closing costs, plus down payment, then they may have to move on to another home. We'll look at that from the listing side in a moment, in terms of explaining that to listing as well. And traditionally, actually under the rules of the VA lending handbook, purchasers using the Veterans Administration guaranteed loans, veteran or active duty, were not allowed to pay compensation directly to their brokerage outside of closing. That rule has been suspended by order of the Secretary of the Veteran Administration while they gather information to see how frequently this may be occurring in the modern market. And in the event that it's common enough, then they can take the data and go to Congress and request that Congress, yes, it will take an act of Congress, remove that rule permanently and allow veterans or those using veterans are active duty or those using a VA guarantee loan to pay their buyer brokerage directly. Okay, we're going to take a look at the listing agent side. Honestly, this is the least complicated because it's spelled out directly in the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. And that is in paragraph 2. Now, I say it's the most direct because it's spelled out and it's just between the seller and the seller brokerage. But there have been some changes to this recently. Most of the seller's brokerage fee, the amount of percentage amount and dollar amount of gross acquisition price. Seller always needs to understand that the way this contract is written is it's on the actual offer price. It's not, and this is not a net. This is not where it's acquisition price minus any of the concessions made. It's simple math. Purchase price times this percent. And then if you're charging any kind of transaction fee. This is the amount that goes to the seller fee brokerage. Now we're going to skip to 2.3 for a moment because this is where you discuss the amount that they're willing to or accept for the buyer brokerage. Again, a dollar amount or flat fee of the gross acquisition price. If nothing is entered here, the company is not authorized to advertise or otherwise communicate that the seller of the company is offering to pay compensation. It is the seller's right to negotiate that. It is the seller's right to say, no, I don't want to offer any compensation. Or leave it blank, let's see what happens. They need to understand that from a marketing perspective, as buyers become interested in their property, buyer's agents are most often going to be reaching out to the listing agent and asking about compensation. How does the seller want us to go about this? Are we going to use the brokerage compensation agreement? They want it addressed in their FC. Are they offering any at all? If they are, what percentage? So I know what to put in their FC. Or if I need to negotiate with my buyer in some way, or have the buyer negotiate with the seller. If they're not offering anything at all, they could be limiting the potential for buyers because buyers may not have down payment amount plus buyer agent compensation amount plus closing costs. That historically the way that this has developed has been that buyer agent commission has always been baked into the price of the home. The sellers have always been prompted that if this is how much you need to net, this is how much we need to sell it for. So by the time you pay off the loans and commissions and everything, then you're where you need to be. If they are not offering any, they may be losing potential buyers who can't afford to pay their agent directly. That's the seller's decision on that risk to make. Now, 2.2. 2.2 is an addition. There are situations where the seller's brokerage may end up in a situation where you represent the seller, but you have an unrepresented buyer. That unrepresented buyer is not entitled to any compensation. They are not a brokerage. They are not an agent. They're not entitled to any kind of compensation. However, they also oftentimes don't have the experience to know what they're doing to do things smoothly. Consequently, it becomes more work for you as the listing agent to make sure that everything is going well in accordance for what your seller needs to have happen for the buyer to be able to complete the transaction. We can do things like provide blank forms to them. We can't fill them out. I can't answer questions about the blank forms. I can simply respond with the seller's written response. I'm not going to nag them about whether or not they're going to do an inspection. I'm not going to be asking them about how the inspection go. That's the buyer's responsibility. But the buyer could be doing things so haphazardly during the course of that it's going to be more work me working, for you to be working out how things are going with your seller. Consequently, you could request here that you receive additional compensation from what would have gone to the buyer agent for that additional work that you're putting in to make sure that this goes in the best interest of your seller. So if the seller has said, look, I'll offer 3% buyer agent commission, and you've got an unrepresented seller, and you know there's the potential for an unrepresented seller and the additional work that causes, you could put anywhere up to that 3% in here and say, it's because I'm working harder to represent you, and there's more liability for me as a agent and you as a seller with this unrepresented buyer that could potentially do something wrong. That's perhaps the most complex part of the entire exclusive right to sell listing agreement right there, is the addition of section 2.2. This has also now been added. This line right here, if this box is marked on the ERS and it comes right after section 2.3, it's its own line, seller does not authorize the company to enter into written compensation agreement with the buyer's brokerage. If this is marked, seller has said you cannot use that real estate brokerage compensation agreement to enter into a separate agreement. I want everything, in other words, everything now is going to have to go through the purchase contract. Going to have to be negotiated there in section 4.3. Want it fully negotiable out there in the open for everybody to fight over. Even if they are offering, so even if they're offering to pay a buyer agent commission, but they mark that, you cannot then say to the buyer agent, we can just use the brokerage compensation agreement. They've already agreed to X amount of the purchase price. It's all going to have to go through the REFC and be negotiated. And as always, we do have to remind sellers that their fees are due and payable at recording or closing, lease effective date or option date. Now, brokerage fees are fully negotiable, not set by law, but there's also this one right here. In the event of listing period or an extension of listing period, the property is withdrawn from sale, transferred, conveyed, leased, rented, or made unmarketable by voluntary act of the seller without written consent of the company, or if the sale is prevented by default of the seller, the brokerage fee shall be immediately due payable to the company. Again, if your seller defaults, or if they make it so difficult you can't sell the property, you can make this due payable. Many of our agents are choosing to use an addendum to the ERS that it's been nicknamed the early out clause, but the clause states, seller and brokerage agree that seller may cancel this at any time upon payment of, and you put in a fee amount in there. You say, basically what I'm doing is I'm covering, I paid, I've had to pay to get the signs. I've incurred expenses, signs, photos, time, gas. If you want out as a seller, we'll let you out. You pay this amount, we'll let you out. That's mutually agreeable. However, if they make it unsellable through their actions, then we have the option of going after that, the full compensation, because it was through their actions that it was defaulted. Okay, as always, I know there's a lot that's in there. If you have questions about those compensations, particularly about negotiating with the REPC, and if you're looking for additional strategies for negotiating that in section 4.3, talk to me, talk to Craig, talk to Marty, talk to some of the other agents here in the brokerage as well. We've had a lot of creative ways of getting that taken care of so that our buyers can continue to afford to buy homes in the market.